Page 115 continued. Thomas Carew, 1598 to 1639. Whereas Herrick looked to Johnson alone, Carew blends in his poetry the metaphysical manner of Donne and the classical spirit of Ben Jonson. His poems on Donne and Johnson express admirably his keen appreciation of his two guides. Johnson was to him the man greater than all men else, and John the poet worth all that went before. As Geoffrey Walton observes, the two influences of Donne and Johnson are fused in him by a considerable native talent. Hardin Craig observes, he borrowed from them to the extent in which a poet of his powers could. From Johnson the great lesson of classic polish, and from Donne a sense of the exciting power of a figure. As an instance, see the following lines. I am a dial's hand still walking around. You are the compass and I never sound. Beyond your circle neither can I show aught but what first expressed is in you. Carew shows more of critical intelligence and sense of pattern than Herrick, but he suffers in the imaginative powers which gets a substitute in a kind of courtly wit. Among his popular poems may be mentioned Upon a Ribbon Tied Upon His Arm by a Lady, a very delightful lyric in long lines. Ask me no more where Jove bestows when June is past the fading rose, a famous song, and that very good didactic lyric, he that loves a rosy cheek. Sir John Suckling, from 1609 to 1642. It is customary to characterize Suckling as both an irresponsible man and an irresponsible poet. Thus, says Legouis, that is Legouis, Legouis, Sir John Suckling typifies the Cavaliers, their loyalty, dash, petulancy, frivolity, easy morals and wit, rich spendthrift, valiant, a gamester and a gallant, an amateur of the drama who wrote 4 not successful plays, and a faithful admirer of Shakespeare. Suckling mocked at the pains Carew took to polish his verses. He was himself an improviser, one whose work is very equal but who writes with irresistible swing. Harding Craig thinks such criticism to be unjustified. His verses, says this critic, shows no evidence of carelessness, and his dreams are rather carefully wrought. On the personal side also, the estimate is a little misleading, since Suckling was a man who respected religion and wrote a treatise on the subject. Hardin Craig is more correct than Legouis because who follows the traditional assessment of Suckling. Suckling in his poetry shows the twin influence of Johnson and Donne. His cynical observations on female capriciousness and inconstancy, and his hard introspective realism remind one of Donne. His general attitude is well leavened with what Geoffrey Walton calls his uninhibited and boisterous cynicism. This attitude determines the spirit of his poetry and the controlling wit. Suckling's delicate sense of observation is exemplified by the following lines from A Ballad Upon a Wedding. Her feet beneath her petticoat like little mice stole in and out, as if they feared the light. His best known poem is a song from Aglora. Why so pale and wan, fond lover? She expresses in a somewhat Donnian sentiment. Richard Lovelace, 1618 to 1658. Lovelace is the least important of the foursome of Cavalier poets named above. He was very well-educated courtier and was even sent to prison for favoring the king actively in the Civil War. End of page 115, now page 116. It was in 1648 that while in prison he prepared for the press his volume entitled Lucasta, epodes, odes, sonnets, songs, etc., to which is added Amarantha, a pastoral, 1649. Though his poems are full of freshness and exuberance, he lacks the fancy of Herrick, the force of Suckling, and the polish of the Carew. He was, says Harding Craig, not so skilful and sustained as Carew, perhaps not as so forceful as Suckling, but not so skilful and sustained as Carew, perhaps not so forceful as Suckling, but had the greatness of having achieved a few immortal utterances. His Elinda's Glove is the prettiest of his short pieces. Thou snowy farm, with thy 5 tenements, tell thy white mysteries. Here was one. They called to pay his daily rents, but she's gathering flowers and hearts is gone, and thou left void to rude possession. Religious poetry. Besides the metaphysical poets and the Caroline poets, religious poetry also occupied an important place in the literature of the period. John Donne was the greatest of the religious poets of the century, and following his example, the metaphysical style was used for religious poetry by such religious poets as George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Richard Crashaw, and many others. John Milton and epic poetry. It was an age of short lyrics rather than of long poems. However, Milton's epics were all exception. Milton, of course, was the greatest poet of the age. He was the connecting link between the Elizabethan and the Puritan ages, combining within himself the influences both of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Ever since the Renaissance, the English poets had been ambitious to write an epic and thus to rival the exploits of ancient Greece and Rome. In this connection, one is reminded of Daniel's The Civil Wars and Drayton's Polyolbion, but they are long narrative poems rather than epics in the classical style. Similarly, Spenser's Faerie Queene is a romantic epic or an epical romance rather than a classical epic of the type of the epics of Homer and Virgil. Later in the 17th century, Abraham Cowley or Davidis and D'Avenan Gondibert both also tried their hands at the epic, but none could succeed. It was left for Milton to achieve this goal, and in the cosmic sweep and range of his epic to surpass even the ancients. Therefore, it would be correct to say that Milton say that the English epic brings an end with begins and ends with Milton. Milton's life. John Milton was born in Bread Street, Cheapside, London on 10th December 1608, or some 4 years before Shakespeare's retirement to Stratford. His father, though strongly Puritan in his sympathies, was nonetheless a lover of literature and art, and the child enjoyed all the advantages of a cultivated home. He was educated at St. Paul's School and at Christ College, Cambridge, where he remained 7 years, taking his BA in 1629 and his MA in 1632. His systematic studies did not, however, close with the close of his college course. Realizing that he could not consistently and conscientiously enter the church for which he had been intended, and feeling no call to any other profession, he decided to give himself up entirely to self-culture and poetry. Fortunately, his father was in a financial position to further his wishes, and on leaving Cambridge he accordingly took up his abode in the country house of the family at Horton, Buckinghamshire. Some 7 years old, Buckinghamshire, some 17 miles from London. While a boy at school, as he himself tells us, his books had kept him out of bed till midnight, and at university he had shown the same untiring devotion to learning, and now during 6 years of uninterrupted seclusion he was able to pursue his studies undisturbed. Building steadily upon the firm foundations he had already laid, Milton thus became a very great scholar. This point must be carefully marked, not only because in the breadth and accuracy of his edition. This point must be carefully marked, not only because in the breadth and accuracy of his erudition he stands head and shoulders above all his other poets, but also because his learning everywhere nourishes and interpenetrates his poetic work. I am repeating, this point must be carefully marked, not only because in the breadth and accuracy of his erudition he stands head and shoulders above all other poets, but also because his learning everywhere nourishes and interpenetrates his poetic work. Having now reached his 30th year, he resolved to complete his studies by travel. He therefore left London in May 1638 and went by way of Paris to Italy, whence, however, he was prematurely recalled by news of the critical state of things at home. While I was preparing to pass over into Sicily and Greece, he writes, the melancholy intelligence which I received of the civil commotions in England made me alter my purpose, for I thought it base to be travelling for my amusement abroad while my fellow citizens were fighting for liberty at home. He was back in London in August 1639 after an absence of 15 months, and from 1640 onwards was increasingly active as a supporter of the Puritan cause against the Royalists. End of page number 116, now page 117. As a pamphleteer, he became indeed one of the great pillars of the cause, and on the establishment of the Commonwealth was appointed Latin Secretary to the Committee for Foreign Affairs. In 1643, a terrible calamity overtook him. His sight, which had long been failing, was now ruined entirely by overstress of work, and he became totally blind. 3 years later, he married again, but his wife Catherine Woodcock died within 15 months. On the restoration of monarchy, Milton was arrested and 2 of his books were publicly burnt by the hangman, but he was soon released and permitted to drop into political obscurity. He was now poor and lonely as well as blind. He felt bitterly the failure of the cause for which he had toiled so hard and sacrificed so much, and though his third wife Elizabeth Minshull brought comfort to his declining years, he was greatly distressed by the unfilial conduct of his daughters by his first marriage. It was in darkness and sorrow, therefore, that he now turned back upon the ambitious political designs which he had cherished many years before and had long set aside at the call of practical duty. His Paradise Lost was published in 1667, Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes together in 1671. 3 years later, on 8th November 1674, Milton died. Characteristics of Milton's poetry. After Shakespeare, Milton is the greatest English poet, which means that he is the greatest English poet outside the drama. Moreover, in the almost unanimous judgment of the critics, he is to be regarded as one of the 3 or 4 supreme poets in the world. In him we have a wonderful union of intellectual power and creative power, both at the highest. He is also a consumatic literary artist whose touch is sure in delicate detail as in vast general effects. While many qualities thus go to the making of his work, however, the one which we most naturally think of, and which indeed we have come to denote by the epithet Miltonic, is his sublimity. He is the most sublime of English poets and our one acknowledged master of what Matthew Arnold calls the grand style. In sustained majesty of thought and diction, he is unrivaled. His descriptive power too is astonishing, as we can learn for ourselves by turning, for example, to the scenes in hell in the opening books of Paradise Lost. And while he was entirely lacking in the true dramatic sense, the magnificent debate in the council of the fallen angels and the whole conduct of the temptation of Eve show an extraordinary insight into motive and character. Though in theory an epic poem is supposed to be quite impersonal, Milton's epic is throughout instinct with the spirit of man himself. Narrow he often is. He is often hard and austere, but there is an intensity of individuality in everything he writes which is singularly impressive. There is an intensity of individuality in everything he writes which is singularly impressive, and the loftiness of his temper and his passionate moral earnestness makes us feel, as we read, that we are indeed in the presence of the one whose soul was like a star and dwelt apart. Prose. The prose of earlier half of the 17th century is even more varied than its verse, and the lines are harder to distinguish. This is partly because of the more varied functions that prose has to serve. practical, informative, persuasive, rhetorical, artistic, functions which at times were not clearly distinguished and some of which overlapped those of verse, and partly because there was as yet no prose of everyday use as a norm from which significant variations could be made for special purposes. In some respects, nevertheless, the age shows developments in prose roughly parallel to those in the domains of poetry. For the Elizabethans, the great model of a cultivated prose style had been Cicero. Their chief aim was amplification and embellishment, according to the rules of the classical and Renaissance rhetoricians. The new concern was with matter rather than manner, a desire for more concentration and weight, and a preference for the epigrammatic terseness of Seneca or Tacitus. The character writer. Character writing or character is a prose genre